All right, welcome to our third kind of lecture in this little story of three of Turkey, Iran, and Iraq after World War II. We're going to continue on with Iraq now, and this is a story that I know well from obviously all the history and teaching, but I think I mentioned in my previous lecture. My grandparents were born in Iraq, and there's a little bit of extra that I kind of understand, not so much from reading in the books, but just kind of understanding what they went through, what my parents went through, and that element of it. So I'll kind of touch on that again a little bit because I think it kind of adds, primary sources are some of the best that you could use to study history. So here is a quick little recap of what we talked about before. If you remember, after World War I, Iraq became part of that British mandate. Remember, it fell under British control as part of the Ottomans. The Ottomans fall apart. The British take control of it. And the British would be there until 1932. 1932, Iraq gains its independence. A couple names I hadn't given you before, but you do want to jot down. Right after the war ends, what happens with Iraq is, yes, the British are in control, but they also have their own king. They designate a man named King Fazil to be the king. He rules from 1921, 1933, as you see there, works with the British in this kind of transition away from the British mandate to Iraqi independence. He dies in 1933. He has a son named Ghazi. He will rule till 1939. Now, the thing with the son Ghazi, by now Iraq is independent, but then Ghazi dies in a car accident. And therefore, when he dies, his son is very young, right? Because King Ghazi died relatively young. His son Fazil II is really young. Fazil II is only 4 years old. So obviously, as a 4-year-old, he's not going to be able to rule effectively. And then this is where you get the story of Nuri al-Assad that we mentioned, building up to World War II. And that's why when I talked about World War II in the Middle East, I didn't mention Fazil II because he was a child, right? The key person was Nuri al-Assad, and we talked about him with a rivalry with Rashid Ali. So all of that is kind of a recap of what we talked about before with a couple new names that I haven't given you before that now I do want you to know. So what happens in terms of after the war? Well, Iraq is a mess, all right? So let's go through why. So here's again our map. And one of the things that you need to keep in mind when you look at the map of Iraq is that when the British mandate came into power, there's a whole bunch of different people living in Iraq. The three primary groups are Sunni Muslims, Shiite Muslims, and there's also Kurds. And there's also the Jewish population there in Iraq, as I mentioned. And when they said, all right, the British are gone, we're going to draw these lines, they didn't really spend that much time and effort figuring out this nation well. And so because Iraq is so mixed, you have a Kurdish population mainly up in the north, you have a split of Sunnis and Shiites throughout Iraq, and then you have down here on the bottom another country that's going to be created, Kuwait. So that's going to be separate, right? And then you have the Jewish population, a lot living in Baghdad. And all these populations, especially the Sunnis, the Shiites, and the Kurds, really were independent, in many sense. The Kurds didn't want to be part of a greater Iraq, probably. They want their own nation called the Kurdish nation. The Shiites, they end up becoming kind of the minority religion, the majority group in a country, but they have less power, so that becomes an issue. There are more Shiites and Sunnis in Iraq, barely. It's pretty close. So this is many people look at this and say the kind of the origins of why Iraq has been such a mess was the initial kind of creation of the state. And there have been some people who've argued that it would have been better to create three different countries there, one for the Shiites, one for the Sunnis, and one for the Kurds. But that gets into much more detail and into the weeds than we need to. So that's one problem. In other words, what I'm trying to lay out for you right off is Iraq after World War II is just one constant mess after the other. And I want to explain to you why it's a mess. So that's one. Another reason it's a mess, of course, is because of the Jewish exile that had taken place, right? And I'm going to show you a couple images here in a second, or an image here in a second. But as I talked about before, there was a large population of Jewish people in Iraq, and they were very successful. They provided a lot of things, and they were treated poorly. The Jewish people, for a long time, weren't allowed to leave Iraq because what was happening around the same time And we're going to do a whole lecture on this right here where it says Palestine. This, of course, will become modern day Israel. The Jewish people wanted to go here. And for a long time in the 1930s and 40s, the Iraq government said, no, you can't leave because they didn't want them to go, because they didn't want the creation of a Jewish state. And then as you get into 1949, 1950, and the state of Israel was already created, then they told the Jewish people, get out. And that's when they were all forced out. That's kind of when my parents with my grandparents left. My parents were kids. My grandparents were almost adults. And that's the story I was telling you, where everything they had was taken away from them. And they weren't allowed to bring anything. They weren't allowed to sell anything. Everything was sent off. And then they were kind of forced to live in tents for a while as refugees until they were even able to be able to move into what it was now Israel and, establish themselves as in a normal city life dwelling. So anyway, so that was an issue. So you had the issue of the Sunni Shiite Kurd conflict. You had an issue of the Jewish minorities being exiled out of Iraq. All of these things are hurting Iraq. So meanwhile, what's going on? Nouri al-Assad is in power. We get to 1958. 1958, there's a big coup where Nouri al-Assad and Fazil II, right, both Nouri al-Assad and Fazil II in 1958, are removed and executed by a general named General Qasim. And so General Qasim, he comes in 1958, and he's a military man. He simply wants power, and he just not exiled, he removes Nouri al-Assad, removes Fazil II from power, has them both executed. One story is that Nouri al-Assad tried to escape by getting dressed up as a woman, got caught anyways, and killed. And so then Qasim comes into power, and one of the first things Qasim says is Kuwait, down here in the south, is part of Iraq. Which of course is interesting because some of you may be, you're probably actually not old enough, but your parents are probably old enough to remember the 1991 Gulf War, which was all about Kuwait, which I'll talk about that again in a little while. So he claims Kuwait is part of Iraq. And at the time, Iraq didn't have a big army. They only had an army of about 60, 70, 80,000 men. And so Qasim comes in and says, Kuwait is part of Iraq. And the British told him, no, it's not. And Qasim kind of backed off because he knew he couldn't take on, any real opposition. So, but the idea that Kuwait should be part of Iraq is not something that Saddam Hussein came with in 1991. This is something that Iraq has been eyeing for a long time. Why Kuwait? Well, what's in Kuwait? Lots and lots and lots of oil. It's not that it's a big piece of real estate, but it's a lot of oil there. The other thing we see Qasim doing is developing closer ties with the Soviet Union, which of course really worried the United States because this is during the Cold War. And this is where you see a lot of the times when you look at we'll talk about this in another lecture, the Arab-Israeli conflicts, when you talk about the wars between Israel and some of the Arab nations, we see very often the military of the Arab nations was supplied by the Soviet Union. And much of the military of Israel was oftentimes supported by the United States. So this is kind of part of the Cold War story that I kind of touched upon before, I think, in the lecture with Turkey. So right after World War II, you've already got a mess in Iraq, right? You got the internal conflicts between the different groups. The Kurds are going to be treated horribly. The Jewish people are going to be exiled. You have this military coup. And so this is why I'm saying Iraq right out of the gates of World War II is already kind of struggling a bit. All right, so I hope all that's clear. This is a photo I just kind of wanted to show you. This is kind of where my parents lived for a while. And so they lived in these tents, and that's how they had to live for about a little less than a year, I believe, until they were able to kind of finally be able to move into a normal housing dwelling. So this happened to countless numbers of Jewish people, Iraqi Jews. I don't know if you've ever met anybody who's an Iraqi Jew, but I guarantee you they have these stories. And there's actually a big effort today still to try to get some of their land and some of the things they had that were taken away from them while they're still alive, right? My grandparents are now have all passed. And so that generation is pretty much gone, but there's still a little bit left. And like, hey, we still have our stuff there and you never gave back to us. And so there's a temp, but I don't think it's really going to go anywhere, honestly. All right, so anyways, just an interesting image there. All right, so then we get to 1963. And in 1963, Qasim again in power until 1963. Then there's another coup. So what goes around comes around. So meanwhile, again, by 1962, 1963, Qasim had developed some ties with the Soviet Union. Qasim was very cruel to a lot of people, especially the Kurdish population as well there. We're going to come back to them again. Unfortunately, they don't have a nice history in Iraq. And what happens in 1963 is another coup led by what we call the Arif brothers. There are two of them, Muhammad Arif and Abd al-Rahman Arif. And you can see there, I put their names up there for you so you can get them down. And here's the pictures of Muhammad Arif, also known as Abdul Salam Arif sometimes. So sometimes they have different names as well. So if you look this up somewhere, you might see a different name. And the Reef Brothers were military men, right? So you got to follow this carefully. So the Reef Brothers were military men. The political movement was called the Ba'ath Party. So you have two arms working here. You have a political movement to get rid of Qasim, known as the Ba'ath Party. But this political movement to create a different political structure in Iraq needed military help. So they turned to these two brothers, the Reef Brothers, and say, hey, will you help us get rid of Qasim? We could rule together. We'll be the political wing. You'll be the military wing. Everyone's happy. And the Reef Brothers agreed to this, of course. Well, the moment the Reef Brothers succeeded in getting rid of Qasim, who was captured and executed, guess what the Reef Brothers did? They turned on the Ba'ath Party. This is just crazy. It's constant. It's like a soap opera. They turn on the Ba'ath Party. And the Ba'ath Party is forced into hiding just as quickly as they help the coup take place. Because the Arif brothers didn't care about some political movement of the Ba'ath Party. They simply wanted power. And so that's exactly what ended up happening between 1963 and 1968. The Arif brothers, one of them was killed in a helicopter accident, and then the other in 1968 was removed in another coup. Okay, by the Ba'ath Party. So the Ba'ath Party kind of spends about 5 years underground. They kind of quietly build up some military support outside the Arif brother circles. And in 1968, the remaining Arif brother, he's removed from power as well, and he would be overthrown in another coup. So then what? So 1968, I know this is a little tricky to follow some of this because there's this constant people replacing each other for power. You may want to do kind of a little timeline on this, but it should be. I tried to organize it really well for you. I hope with this kind of breakdown, as you can see here, just kind of go in order. So 1968, another coup. This time, the Arif brothers are now gone, right? Bye-bye Arif brothers. They're going to be gone. And when the Arif brothers are gone, they're going to be replaced by the Ba'ath Party again. And this time, the Ba'ath Party is going to be led by a man named Hassan al-Baq. And Hassan al-Baq was a military man, but he was a military man who supported the Ba'ath Party, right? And he had an organization as the RCC. What does the RCC stand for? The RCC stands for the Revolutionary Command Council. And this was the new group now in charge of Iraq. Basically, they're going to be in charge of Iraq from 1968 until Saddam Hussein is going to be overthrown from power, right? So this is going to be a long time, all the way into the after 9/11 period. And so what happens? Well, Hassan al-Baq, he's the guy in charge. Let me show you a picture. This is Hassan al-Baq on the right. And on the left, you may recognize, see, most people have never probably seen this guy before, never heard of the name before. You may have seen the guy on the other side, the left, and this is, of course, Saddam Hussein. How did Saddam Hussein become part of all this? Well, he was al-Baq's right-hand man, right? He was his strong arm, too. He would go to anybody who opposed this new Ba'ath Party, and his job was to beat him into submission, both figuratively and literally. And so he's kind of his right-hand man until 1979. In 1979, al-Bakr, quote unquote, retired. Why do I say he retired? Because Saddam said, all right, I'm done being second person in charge. I want to be in charge. And, al-Bakr realized he was getting older. Saddam was younger. And Saddam, it wasn't like this big, massive military coup like we saw before, but he just kind of shifted his way into power with a little bit of, with very little resistance at all. And now Saddam is in power starting from 1979. So that's all the story of how Saddam Hussein comes into power after World War II. So it's this whole process from these coups from General Qasim to the Ba'ath Party to the Reef Brothers to al-Bakr to now Saddam Hussein. So now the question is, what does Saddam Hussein do once he becomes the ruler of Iraq starting in 1979? And again, more of a mess. This is the whole thing. Iraq is just going to continue on its downward spiral for many years. And it's really unfortunate because the country of Iraq is a beautiful country with such a rich history. I mean, remember, this is where we started this course, Mesopotamia, right? This is the cradle of civilization. And unfortunately, since World War II, this thing has just been a mess. All right, so now we have to talk about Saddam Hussein, his son, kind of this whole terror of Saddam Hussein, as I say, and all of that that takes place during this time period. And also, he had two sons named Uday and Qusay. I want to kind of mention that. So let me run through a little bit about Saddam. Saddam was a monster. There's no really other way around it. Saddam Hussein, from the moment he comes into power, begins to torture the Kurdish people that I mentioned before. The Kurds are going to be gassed during his time in the 1980s. He's going to massacre countless numbers of them. His own political opponents, Saddam Hussein, would torture and kill. Some things I've read about, for example, he wouldn't just kill people, he would torture them. Saddam Hussein, and again, these are all points you want to jot down, obviously. It's not enough to say Saddam Hussein is a bad guy. Well, you got to explain how. He would torture people by putting them in shredders feet first. That's how he would kill them. Or he would force parents to watch the execution of their own children, right? And these are things he did to punish people. He would send in the middle of the night his henchmen to people's homes. And he would try to kind of create this scenario where we're going into somebody's house. You kind of visualize this, right? You're in your bed at night, you get a knock on the door, and they would present themselves as, we're the resistance to Saddam. We know you don't like Saddam either. We have to we're trying to get a whole bunch of people now out. So are you with us, to try to catch them off guard? And if they go, oh yeah, man, I want to get rid of Saddam too, boom, they shoot you. And he used those kind of psychological warfare against his own people, against the Kurds, against his political opponents. And so this is how Saddam stayed in power. He's not so much into the theocracy type thing. He's not this religious zealot as much as more of a kind of a Stalinist type of person, right? Ruling through political terror. He had two sons, Uday and Qusay. Uday was the older one. Qusay was the younger one. Uday, he had the reputation of being just kind of mad, absolutely crazy. It was said that his hobby was raping women and torturing the Olympic soccer team that didn't win games. Qusay was the one that was more mentally stable, and most people believe he would have been the one to replace Saddam Hussein. Both Uday and Qusay were actually killed after the 9/11 took place, and we have this war with Iraq. I'll get into that in a little bit of detail, and both of them were killed by a U.S. military strike. So anyways, this is the reign of Saddam Hussein. It's not pleasant at all during this time period. So that's something you just kind of want to know. And that's all at home. Meanwhile, other than his just reign of terror, even in his own country, then you get the issue of the wars he's part of. And here again, Kuwait's down here in the south. I'll talk about that next. But you have this whole Iran-Iraq war. That's what I want to start with. And so in the late 1970s, 1979, remember when we just lectured on Iran, the Ayatollah takes over, right? The Shah is removed, the Ayatollah is in power. Iran is a Shiite nation. Iraq is all this mixture that I talked about before, right? Sunni, Shiite, Kurds, all of that. And in 1980, when Iran now was under the Shiite Ayatollah control, Iraq was very worried. Saddam was worried that the Shiites in Iraq would rise up, and he decides to declare war against Iran. And there's this brutal war that lasts for almost throughout the 1980s. About 1 million people are killed, and it's Muslim fighting Muslim. It's primarily a Shiite Sunni war. During the war, the United States intervened to help Iraq. And you go, well, you just got through describing how awful Saddam Hussein was. Why would we have helped Iraq? Well, remember what else had happened. 1979, 1980, the hostage crisis. Iran was this kind of sworn enemy of the United States. And at the time, the U.S. felt Iran was a bigger threat than Iraq, and we didn't want Iran to win. Honestly, we didn't want Iraq to win either. We didn't want either of them to become this dominant power. And people have questioned, how could we have fought against Saddam and then fight against him, fought with Saddam and fight against him? I mean, guys, that happens all the time in history. Think of World War II, right? The United States and England sided with Stalin, and people asked Churchill, "How can you fight with Stalin? He's such a monster." And Churchill said, "Well, if Hitler invaded hell, I'd have a few nice things to say about the devil." And so that's just the sad reality in history. Sometimes you have to make deals with people you don't like because the other side might be potentially worse. And so it wasn't that we wanted Iraq to win, but we definitely didn't want Iran to win either. So this was kind of a bloody war, went on for a long time, eventually kind of fizzled out in a stalemate. But it was one of the things Saddam Hussein was involved in throughout the 1980s. Now, the other country Saddam Hussein wanted is way down here in the south, and that's Kuwait. And this leads to another war in 1991. So this is the Gulf War in 1991, where Saddam Hussein decided, I'm invading Kuwait, right? And he did this pretty quickly, and everyone was caught off guard, and he moved into Kuwait very fast. Saddam had a massive army by then. Kuwait had nothing. And this is where you get what was called Operation Desert Shield and Operation Desert Storm, led by the United States, but not just by the United States. The United States led the 1991 Gulf War. The key general there is General Schwarzkopf. Again, anybody of that generation knows this guy's name really well. He was an incredibly popular U.S. general at the time. And he was the one who kind of led the U.S. forces, but really was in charge of the overseeing of this war against Saddam Hussein. So Saddam invades Kuwait, and then you get first Operation Desert Shield. And that was to just send a massive number of American forces, but not just American forces. This was a massive coalition, British, French, Arab countries. Everybody said, no, Saddam, you can't do this. And it wasn't just that he wanted Kuwait, he also wanted Saudi Arabia. And again, why? Lots of oil there. And so that lasted for a long time, several months, Desert Shield, and they basically told Saddam, leave, you got to leave. He wouldn't leave. And then they had Operation Desert Storm, which was then taking the U.S. forces, moving into Kuwait, pushing the Iraqi forces out. And that happened fairly easily. It was an overwhelming victory in terms of getting Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. That was the easy part. However, it wasn't smooth completely. There was a war, and one of the things Saddam used were Scud missiles. And these Scud missiles were rockets that he would send into Saudi Arabia. We had barracks there. We had one barrack that was hit, and a number of our military men were killed. But more importantly, he was also sending Scud missiles into Israel. Now, Israel actually stayed out of this war. They're like, we're not involved. And keep in mind, by 1991, Iraq had attacked Israel multiple times. And why did Saddam Hussein send Scud missiles into Israel? Well, the reason he sent Scud missiles into Israel is he wanted Israel to get involved. Why? Because remember, I just got through saying, and then when the 1991 war started, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, he invaded Saudi Arabia. In 1991, Israel did not have greatest relationship with other Arab nations. And so what Saddam was hoping is Israel would attack Iraq, and then the other Arab nations that were joining with the U.S. at the time would say, well, we're not going to fight with you. And so it took a lot of desperation. This was when President Bush the older was in office, right? Older President Bush, not younger President Bush. And it took a lot of convincing to keep Israel out of the war. And it was scary. Those Scud missiles were not very accurate, but you fire enough of them, and they did tremendous damage. And actually, I had an aunt of mine whose backyard's home was hit by a Scud missile, and the entire side of their house was shattered, and they were, thank God no one was killed, but they lived in Tel Aviv, and one of the rockets hit right next to their home, and they were sent to the hospital. They just had some minor injuries, but again, this is something one of my aunts went through, lived in Israel at the time. And then, of course, Saddam also is going to go after the Kurdish population as well. He's going to use this wartime period to go after the Kurds more as well. And so it was just a horrible war in that sense, but he was pushed out of Kuwait. These are the Scud missiles, and this is a kind of a very typical image you see on the right of people having to wear gas masks because of the Scud missiles. Because one of the things that people were worried about was chemical warfare, that Saddam Hussein had chemical weapons. We know he had them because he used them against the Kurdish people. There was no doubts. Did Saddam Hussein have chemical weapons? Well, yeah, he had them. He used them, and there was concern he was going to put Scud missiles, gas weapons on the Scud missiles, and that's why people were wearing these gas masks in Israel and other Arab nations. In Israel, Saudi Arabia specifically, especially because they were worried that, hey, these masks would happen. There was this kind of attempt. The U.S. had this missile defense called the Patriot system. Horrible, didn't work very well to try to shoot down the Scuds. Today, Israel's developed something much better called the Iron Dome, which is just an amazing piece of technology that Israel developed on its own to kind of shoot down any rockets coming into them, and they've unfortunately had to use that multiple times since its development. I want to say it developed around 2016, the Iron Dome, so that was more effective. So anyways, those are the Scud missiles, and you had that situation. All right, so Saddam Hussein is defeated in the war in 1991. But then the question is, what do they do? And the older Bush decided, well, we got him out of Kuwait, we're done, we're going home. And they just kind of left Iraq under Saddam's control. Saddam punished the Kurds. He massacred many of the Kurds as a result of this, and this kind of hurt. Many people in the northern part of Iraq were really hoping the U.S. would still be involved. The U.S. would come in and help them. The U.S. would take out Saddam in 1991. That didn't happen. The U.S. decided, our goal was to stop him from taking over Kuwait, and we did. Then we jump to 9/11, right? 9/11 happens. The World Trade Centers fall, just that horrible nightmare that I'll do a little lecture on. Saddam Hussein was not involved in 9/11. By now, President Bush the younger is in office, right? Clinton was president of the United States building up to 9/11. Then 9/11 happens during the younger Bush administration. And when President Bush the younger was in office, even though he acknowledged, President Bush the younger never said Saddam Hussein was part of 9/11. That was never part of the narrative, right? But what he did say is 9/11 just happened. We just saw that people were able to do all this damage to us. We also know that Saddam Hussein had historically used chemical weapons. And we also know that Saddam Hussein supported terrorist groups, which he did. Saddam Hussein did not support al-Qaeda per se, but he supported other terrorist groups. That we know for sure. And so what Bush was doing is making this connection. So we got Saddam Hussein, bad guy. We got him potentially developing more chemical weapons, maybe nuclear weapons. And now what happens? And he supports terrorist groups. And we just saw 9/11. What happens if he takes this and puts it together and then uses it to attack the United States? 9/11 would look like a walk in the park. And so he demanded that Saddam Hussein stop all his chemical weapon development, nuclear development, and all of that. Saddam Hussein said, I don't want to let any inspectors in here. And it was this kind of cat and mouse game for a while. And then President Bush said, all right, well, then Saddam Hussein needs to removed from power. And then we ended up with the second Gulf War, right? And the issue is we got Saddam Hussein out of power. He was eventually found, tried, executed. But when we got Saddam Hussein out of power, what that did is trigger kind of this Sunni Shiite conflict in Iraq, right? And then we have American troops in there, and then you have Al Qaeda moving into Iraq, and then it becomes this just kind of crazy funnel of different agendas trying to maintain power there. And it was very hard. There was a period of time where we were able to get a bit of stability in Iraq, and then we started under the Obama administration to pull troops out. Things started to go south a little bit again, and it's just kind of this roller coaster right now. Sometimes there's more stability, sometimes there's less stability. It's one of those things that's very difficult. If you don't go into Iraq and you don't remove Saddam Hussein from power, what if he actually develops a nuclear weapon and does something with it, right? Then people go, well, you didn't do anything. And if you do go in, then you have this problem of this split nation fighting each other and American forces stuck in the middle. Um, you know, some people that made the argument, if you're going to go in, you got to stay in there forever, right? That you can't go in, get rid of Saddam, and just leave, because then you get this whole internal civil war ensuing. But then how long are you committed to staying in there? And so that's where these global situations are tricky. And there's different philosophies about this. There's this kind of more isolationist philosophy. You just kind of stand alone, and you let them do their thing. And then if they attack us, you just go after the countries that just attacked you. There is this idea of a more preemptive approach where, we can't wait for that to happen, right? Because it's too dangerous. So some of these are not easy answers. One thing I do want to be clear on is this, very often they say, well, we went in to find chemical weapons and Saddam did not have chemical weapons. You will hear that, and that is actually the mainstream narrative. That no, Saddam did not have chemical weapons after the war. He absolutely did. He had the weapons. We found stockpiles of it. Where you get into semantics is, did he have an ongoing campaign to build more chemical weapons or to build more nuclear weapons? That question is more unanswered. But if anybody says, no, Saddam did not really have chemical weapons, that's just not true. He did. He used them. He had stockpiles of them. American troops found them. In fact, I have an article from the New York Times years after the Second Gulf War, talking about how American troops got sick because they found these stockpiles of chemical weapons. And so, yes, we know he had them. So, this is where Iraq is. And as I said at the start of this lecture, it's a bit of a mess, Iraq. It's just this constant influx. There's constant conflict. There's occasional some stability there. And, what the future holds, who will know? But it's a pretty crazy little history after World War II. And I hope kind of this lecture kind of showed you that it's a lot of drama, a lot of history, a lot of crazy stuff there. All right, so I hope you find all that interesting. We're going to move on to our next topic, which is incredibly important one, maybe one of the most important topics we cover all semester in this class. And it is the entire story of the rebirth of the State of Israel, the Arab-Israeli conflicts that come from that, the issue of the impact on the Palestinians as well. And so there's going to be a very important series of lectures coming up next. All right, thank you. Hope you found all that interesting.